Welcome, everyone. My name is Sue Parker. I'm the denominational minister from the Mennonite Church. I'm so glad you're here joining us tonight to talk about the cost of war. This webinar is part of MCUSA's Learn, Pray, Join series, an initiative to highlight key peace and justice issues with the wider church. We wanted to begin this year by examining militarism and providing opportunities to deepen this conversation as a church. Some of you may be aware that MCUSA, Mennonite Mission Network, and Mennonite Central Committee are working together to create resources and highlight our faith witness as Mennonites against militarism. And by militarism, the panelists are working with the following definition that we have on our PowerPoint. Can see that would be great. Thank you. This is our working definition. Militarism invests the resources of a nation in military training, weapons production, and the projection of military powers as the primary means to national security and the protection of economic interests. In a spiritual sense, militarism is a commitment to salvation through violence. In the US, the reality is hyper-militarism, in which military solutions permeate all aspects of life. This colonizes our minds and imagination and creates a mutually reinforcing web of interests that profit from fear and domination. As noted in the definition, militarism in America has become hyper-militaristic, securing global military dominance. The Department of Defense spends more than $700 billion a year, totaling more than the next 10 countries combined. The enormous and complex tentacles of militarism extend not only outside of our borders, but pervade inside our country. The militarization of schools and policing in our most vulnerable communities have costly consequences. As militaristic culture has become more normalized, it has become more difficult to resist against it. Mennonite Church is a historic peace church who have resisted war based on Jesus' teaching of nonviolence and loving enemies. We are known around the world as a historic peace church. But how about now? Are we living into our identity as a peace church now? To help us to have this honest conversation as Jesus' followers, we called 4 esteemed panelists to be with us. Join me in welcoming Sunitha Millsap, Weldon Nisley, Linda Peachy, and Rick Yoder. Due to limited time, I will not read their extensive and impressive bios, and they're just too humble to even hear all the things that we have to say, I'm sure. But if you haven't had a chance to read about who they are and what they are about, we'll also have a link in the chat box to tell you a little bit about them. For the next 60 minutes or so, I think we're gonna go a little bit over the hour. We hope to cover 6 questions with the panelists. So let me just jump right into the first question with Linda and Sunitha. And if possible, it would be great if those of you who are not muted, mute yourself right now, because we really want to hear all of our panelists speak. So let me jump right into the first question with Linda and Sunitha. How has militarism impacted your community, and what is the cost of war in your community or in your church?
Okay, I think I was tasked to go first. So I want to talk a little bit about the 2 primary communities in which I've lived as an adult. So in the early 1980s, my husband Titus and I lived in Laos for 5 years as Mennonite Central Committee workers. And there, the effects of militarism were very immediate and visible because they had been caught up in the Vietnam War And so there was lots of evidence of displacement of people and the destruction that was visited on the land because primarily US bombing that had happened during the war. So there's also, in the aftermath of that, great difficulty rebuilding and working the land due to lethal anti-personnel bombings that still remain in the soil. And these have to be found very carefully and very painstakingly, one by one, and there are millions and millions of them. So this remains a huge problem even 45 years later, and with thousands of people, even though there are thousands of people continuing to do the clearance work.
Would that work better for us?
And in fact, earlier this month in Laos, we learned of an accident where 2 children were just killed and 3 wounded when they found some bombies on their way home from school. So this is continuing to be a problem, even though the war has been over for many, many, many years. So now I want to shift to our life back here in the United States. We settled in Southeast Lancaster City, and we've lived here for the past 35 years. Here, I would say the effects of militarism are seen primarily in terms of a lack of investment and resources. Too little available for education, for healthcare, for safe housing, for living wage jobs. And because so much of our national wealth is spent on the military, many lack what they need for overall well-being. And so I could say more about that, but I know probably Sunitha will. So I also wanted to mention sort of the effects that militarism has in our churches. And here, I think it really stunts our imaginations and our ability to really trust that God's power, the power of courageous love, can save us and create shalom or well-being. And since militarism is embedded so thoroughly throughout our communities, in our jobs, in our education, our political and civic life, I think it makes it very hard for the church to speak out and to challenge these realities or propose any alternatives. And I think this creates a sense of numbness and helplessness, which really can lead to spiritual death. I think militarism also really hinders our solidarity and connection to brothers and sisters around the world who are harmed by our nation's wars and military actions. And this really harms the worldwide body of Christ and our witness as followers of Jesus. And so that's all. I'll pass this over to Sunitha now.
Thank you, Linda. I would agree with almost everything Linda said, especially the part of how it affects the communities in which where money could be being spent. For my community directly, I'm speaking most of the African-American community and the neighborhoods in which I've grown up in and lived in Chicago and Elkhart. And it really depends on, you know, what kind of family support this enlistee would have. The economic means that they are either coming from. It's a much different story for a young man who is educated and has a large family support and has high education, high grades in school. He will go into the service looking with better chances than one who was coming out of poverty and one who may not have strong academic grades and things behind him. It depends on their mental and emotional state of mind. One of the things in which it bothers me the most about the military is how little they pay attention to the actual state of mind, the mental and emotional health of those that they are bringing on as far and considering soldiers. My concern for the military is the inability and lack of concern for the veterans and those that have been dishonorably discharged because of mental health reasons. In my community, you see this a lot. Many of them that didn't or couldn't cut it as a soldier will come home. And if they don't surely end up in prison, they're caught up somehow in some kind of mental or emotional state where their families are constantly trying to care for them in very unhealthy situations. The fact that many of our local police are trained with these military style trainings, or they're hiring ex-military who haven't been fully vetted, whether or not they are even ready to work in our communities, they are just plopped in our communities because clearly our government sees us as the group that needs the most harshest way of policing. And then one of the main things is what I see now in young Black and brown boys and girls is this increased belief in their own need to gravitate towards weapons. Everybody feels like they themselves have to have a weapon, 2 and 3 guns, more and more. They got to go to the driving range. You'd be amazed at how much young Black and brown girls and boys are spending on guns and other forms of weaponry. All of them thinking the other is the enemy, and even the other as the person who lives just across town. And so our sort of sense that the only way we survive is this violence against or towards one another. And I believe more than anything, we have to find a new narrative. We as a country, we as a nation, definitely we as a church, we have to work a little bit harder about what we are actually saying, and helping others to understand our definition of militarism, how it is affecting us. And I think the church just has a lot more work to do. And so these kind of seminars, thank you for MC USA deciding that this is where we needed to start.
Wow, we could just unpack everything that you guys have said, but we'll move on to the next questions. And if you, audience, have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists later, you can also put that in the chat box now, and we can just kind of work through that a little bit later. The second question that I wanted to ask was, and ask Weldon, Rick, and Sunitha, how has your faith shaped your response to militarism?
Thank you, Sue, and everyone for joining us. A long time mantra, or very formative for me, is no Jesus, no peace, as in N-O, transformed by no Jesus, no peace, as in K-N-O-W. I know that knowing Jesus means war is the problem, not the answer. As my friend David Swenson in War is a Lie has helped us see very clearly, or Rosa Brooks, is how everything became war and the military became everything. In 1949, in fact, the Department of War became the Department of Defense in the United States. Words matter and names matter. More personally, I was born at the end of World War II, and just days before the August 6 and 9 bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And somehow I grew up in rural Iowa on a farm, but being both fascinated and troubled, almost obsessed by war. And I read everything I could find on World War II. I was troubled by war and inspired by those who said no to war. Coming of age then in the 1960s with the Vietnam War and civil rights and Martin Luther King and so on was defining. But in rural Iowa, I was troubled by the presumed apolitical posture of our rural Iowa Mennonite community, being the silent in the land. So in the late 60s, I left the church in faith and became a political organizer and activist. But political engagement brought me back to the church because I learned 2 things. First, everything is political, so there is no apolitical place. And second, integrity and sustainability in political engagement must be grounded in faith and faith community. Political engagement then led me back to the church and formal peace and pastoral ministry for over 4 decades, from 1973 to 2013, including peace studies at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, which taught me that just war is justified war that transfers violence onto the enemy as in sacrificial violence. In contrast, the just peace of Jesus transforms the violence of hate into nonviolent love. I've been blessed by over 4 decades of peace and pastoral ministry with Mennonite Central Committee and as pastor at Cincinnati Mennonite and Seattle Mennonite Church, where being a peaceful presence locally, nationally, and globally was a call and commitment. It led me to Nicaragua twice, in 1984 with Witness for Peace, and in 1990 with Pastors for Peace, and then with Christian Peacemaker teams and CPT in Iraq and Palestine at various times since 2003. War is not the way of Jesus and is never the way of peace, as A.J. Muste, the old pacifist from a century ago, taught us. There is no way to peace, peace is the way. And that's what I sort of share about my faith commitment tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Weldon, and hello, everyone. As with most things in life, my response to militarism has a lot of sources, but certainly one of those is rooted in my Anabaptist Mennonite faith tradition, going back to my childhood years as well as an adult. I'll just mention some of these. In my growing up years, a number of things were important. For example, in 6th grade Sunday school class, I memorized the Sermon on the Mount, and that's where I learned about loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. We had Martyr's Mirror at home, where the stories and pictures were powerful, especially, you can guess, Dirk Williams pulling his pursuer from the icy waters. Mennonite Central Committee volunteers speaking at my small church near Dayton, Ohio, who were doing alternative service instead of joining the military. Our house was about, 3 miles from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was one of 7 strategic air command bases in the US, with lots of those giant B-52 bombers flying overhead every day. Training to deliver weapons of destruction on some far-off land. Well, these MCCers presented a different model for doing life. Seeing posters of that Menno Simons quote that said, "The regenerated do not go to war." These kinds of stories and experiences had a deep effect on me. I mean, even Stalin knew the power of stories when he said, "The death of one person is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Why? Because that one person is a story of someone's father, husband, wife, son, and it touches the heart, not just the head. So stories were powerful, and I had plenty of them growing up. As an adult, I'll mention a couple things that stand out as well. Being an activist most of my life in a variety of causes compelled me to think deeper about faith and whether it did any good in this world. Understanding, finally, the emphasis on being followers of Jesus and what that meant. And for me, that meant things like, blessed are the peacemakers, doing justice, loving mercy, bringing good news to the poor, and letting the oppressed go free. Some books and people from which I found inspiration include, Don Crable's The Upside Down Kingdom, Ron Sider's various books on nonviolence, Sojourner's Liberation Theology, learning about MLK, John Lewis, Gandhi, Rosa Parks. I mean, there's lots of sources, lots of people and places. Also, the Anabaptist emphasis, as I learned around midlife, on ethics over doctrine, or as they say, orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy. And then what I saw and experienced living and working in some 20 countries around the world, some of which were devastated by war and civil strife, and where much of this was fed by sales of American military weapons and hardware. And then from psychotherapists and counselors who work with veterans, we learned that for many, the war never leaves them. It's an internal war that too often has harmful consequences throughout their lives. So the cost of war are enormous. And it's not just that 47% of the federal budget that goes to military spending, but it's also the human cost. Cost that can't be captured by statistics. And going along with that just seems inconsistent with the worldview and values and faith that I claim. I think I have time to add one more comment. Historically, as we've just heard, Anabaptists have been opposed to war because it's seen as contrary to the will of God and the way of Jesus. This is basically a kind of, I don't know what you call religious ideology position. That is an unsatisfactory answer to the pragmatist of the world, sometimes to me, actually. Well, there's some good empirical research being done, in particular the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, with their book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, that gives empirical support, not just ideas, but empirical support for the effectiveness of nonviolence, just what pacifists have been looking for a long time. It's a statistical analysis of over 300 violent and nonviolent civil resistance campaigns in over 140 countries between 1900 and 2015, I think. And the authors found that groups who used nonviolent civil resistance to pursue their goals of regime change or getting rid of foreign occupiers were twice as successful as groups that use violent resistance, even when dealing with very harsh regimes. If you've not seen this, I highly recommend it. Anyway, these are some of the ways that my faith in life, interacting in this world, have shaped my response to militarism. Sunitha, on to you.
Well, to both Weldon and Rick, I would say pretty much of what they said also fits where my faith lies. I wholeheartedly believe in nonviolence and a peace witness. And so it's hard to say that's who you are and then do just the opposite. And war to me is just the opposite of that in and of itself. So I believe that what makes us, Jesus followers is the fact, and definitely Jesus followers as those that follow Jesus and not those that claim to be Christian, because just saying Christian nowadays doesn't hold as much weight. Those that are actually following Jesus and Jesus's examples. My faith forces me to look at life through those lenses. The other piece to me about my faith and how I feel about militarism has to do with the fact that when you come from an oppressed community, a marginalized community, and you can't win in any of these wars that rage around you, whether it's domestic violence. As a kid growing up in my home, growing up in a house where domestic violence was there and seeing power over, growing up in a neighborhood where there was constant warring amongst neighbors and people, whoever was the biggest, whoever had the most always won. If you're part of that marginalized or oppressed community, you know full well going into war isn't really your best interest. And so you have to think of other ways in which you can bring about peace. And so part of my faith it lies in the fact that it's an unlevel playing field. And so following Jesus is to help us figure out ways through and navigate a world that isn't fair for all of us in the first place. And I don't see how anyone beyond that could look at any of the pictures or the videos or anybody that can look at what war has done and walk away from that thinking that that was the best option. That makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. It is always those that we are being asked to hate. Now, I want to say this piece. So even now, we are being asked to hate Putin and Russia. I do not know Putin for any more than what they show us on TV. And I have not met yet a Russian who has said or done anything to me. So why would I make them my enemy? It is hard for me to have an enemy because I am a child of God. And so even though I might be angry with you about the way you act or things you do as a child of God, it is not in me, or it should not be in me, to be so angry or so upset or wanting power so much that at all costs I would bring harm to anyone else. And my faith tells me that.
Thank you so much. The costliness of war, the price that we pay. Rick, I have a question for you. Is paying taxes for war the new form of conscription? Is calling for a new form of CO?
Interesting question. The quick answer, I would say, is yes. But here's the issue as I see it. Over time, the nature and methods of warfare have shifted from being labor intensive and needing lots of soldiers to being capital and technology intensive and thus needing lots of money and fewer soldiers. And as we've heard and as we know, Mennonites, along with other peace churches, have taken the position of being opposed to war and refusing to participate in the military. And then as World War II was looming, significant efforts were made by the representatives of these historic peace churches to have the US government allow conscientious objectors not to participate in war activities. And if I have my history right, this special status was granted in the Conscription Act of 1940. So my question is, how is it that we believe, at least historically, in not physically participating in war, but are okay with paying for war through our war taxes? Why is this different? Of course, I've wondered why most Mennonites today don't seem concerned about this and pay their war taxes. And if I may say, including theologians and others deeply committed to peace and peace building. I've also wondered if war tax resistance is something that only the older granola generation cares about, the 60s and 70s folks who are active in civil rights and anti-Vietnam and women's rights and so forth. I know a few younger people who are engaged in war tax resistance, but most I know are the older generation. And I noticed most people in this participating in this webinar, white-skinned like I do, and with a nod towards Sunitha's comments, I've also wondered if I were Black or brown, how would that influence my willingness to be a war tax resistor? So here's my question coming out of this. Could Mennonites, MCUSA, MCC, whoever, go beyond resolutions made at the regular National Assemblies and once again join other peace churches and groups to do something similar today and petition the government to allow conscientious objection to paying war taxes? I would guess that if the draft were to return with no CO exemption for our sons and daughters, these same peace churches would once again lobby for an exemption. So why not with our tax dollars? What's different? I might also add that with the conservative Supreme Court we now have, where religious liberty is so important, and given some of the cases that they've passed, now is an excellent opportune time to bring this forward through the court system, rather than through Congress, as has been tried unsuccessfully for years with the Religious Freedom Peace Tax Fund that's been sponsored by John Lewis each year. So that's a challenge, I guess. Okay, that's it. On to you.
I think I see a lot of nods as Rick was speaking, like, preach it, come on, we can do this. I saw a lot of hallelujahs, I think. So then tell us, and I'm gonna ask Weldon, Linda, and Rick, how did you become a war tax resistor?
Thank you again, Sue, and Rick, thanks. That was a great segue, and I certainly echo and say amen to what you shared. The war in Vietnam helped me see that my body was not needed as much as my tax dollars. About 1970, we began withholding a portion of our federal income taxes and contributing that amount withheld to MCC and later to CPT each year. each year then I wrote a letter to IRS, to the president, to our senators, our congressperson, to the local newspaper, and to the Mennonite, and a few other places as a way of giving witness to what we're doing and why we're doing and how we're doing it. We also withheld the federal excise tax on phone service because between the 60s and following that, that was an explicit tax for waging war. We can talk about that a long time. It was not a lot, but it was a way to keep very, very active. Every month have to do something. So we lived quite a number of different places over the decades. And every time we got a new phone service, then I would prepare a document to explain what we're doing. And each month, then I would put in the amount we're withholding. And at the end of the year, I would send that to MCC. And that also provided lots of opportunity for witness and was a monthly active witness. One month I forgot to withhold the tax on phone service, and the phone company called and asked if I really meant to pay it. And so we arranged that I wish the next month I withheld 2 months taxes on that. So that was an interesting conversation. Another time I had a long conversation with a long distance phone company, a rep, and she was just wanting to know what this means because she received the document why I was not paying that amount and wanted to know more about it. We had this long conversation and all of a sudden she said, I wish I could do that. And I said, you can, it's easy. Here's how you do it. So it gives plenty of opportunity for a witness. And other time I had IRS actually levied, when I was pastor at Cincinnati Mennonite Church, IRS levied the church to recover the funds that from my pastoral salary that they had done. Well, the church went through a rather intense and a very, very good congregational process and came to a consensus decision not to comply with IRS's request in that case. So again, just an opportunity for witness. There are many other of those I could tell. The Bible tells us that the number one thing we are to be and do is love. And the number one thing we are not to do and be is fear. Do not be afraid, we are told over and over. For most people, the intimidation, IRS works by intimidation. And if you're not intimidated, if you're not afraid, it's not difficult at all to be a war tax resistor. Thomas Merton said, fear is the root of war. The God of peace is never glorified by human violence. And I would say fear without love leads to war. Love without fear disrupts militarism to end war. So I'll pass it on now to Linda.
Well, thank you, Weldon. Yeah, well, Titus and I both grew up in Mennonite homes that were committed to conscientious objection to military service. We grew up hearing about that, and so war tax resistance seemed like a logical extension of that commitment. And then, of course, Titus had spent 3 years in Vietnam during the war, and those experiences only heightened that concern, as did our later experiences in the country of Laos. And when we were in Laos, we found ourselves often saying that we hadn't found any reason to pay war taxes, but only actually more reasons not to. And so over the many decades, our practice has varied somewhat with a combination of the following. And some of these are similar to what Weldon explained too. I think the first thing we tried was to limit our taxable income by living on one income and by giving generously through our tithes and contributions. And when we worked at MCC, we also reduced our salaries for some of those years. That was one way to reduce what we owed to the IRS. but living below the taxable income level is actually pretty hard. And so because it's the taxable level, actually, I think maybe that's changed, but it has been quite low. So that's a difficult challenge. When we did owe income taxes, we tried to withhold some portion of that by making sure that we actually still owed something at the end of the year that hadn't already been withheld from our paychecks. So that meant really paying attention to what was withheld. And sometimes then we would try to calculate the percentage of military spending and withhold that portion. Other times we withheld more symbolic amounts. And then of course we always gave the withheld amount to a nonprofit organization, and we would write a letter to the IRS explaining what we were doing. And we often did also copy our Congress people, our pastors, and so on, so that it was a public witness. Of course, then the IRS tried to collect those withheld funds and added on lots of fees and penalties. And so we tried various ways to try to avoid having them collect that money. Sometimes we would ask our church board to write a letter to the IRS vouching for our that these were deeply held religious beliefs. And sometimes, yeah, then the IRS would respond saying, oh, well, we need to study this a little bit more. And so they seem to take that seriously. Although, yeah, often, yeah, we would end up paying in some way or another. There was one time Titus was surprised to find 3 IRS agents at our door, wondering where our bank account was, because they wanted to take the money out of our bank account. And because we used a Mennonite credit union, they had trouble finding it, locating where it was. And so for a couple years then, we also even tried to avoid using a bank, but that's pretty hard to do too. I mean, it forced us to rely on using cash and money orders for a while, so that didn't last too long. The IRS also did try, they went to MCC and tried to put a levy on our salaries. And MCC at that time had a policy of not complying with the levy unless without board approval. And so they asked the IRS to find some other way to get the funds, and the IRS never pressed that. So as you can see, it's not a simple process to be a tax resistor. And I think we often found ourselves, you have to keep wondering, how far am I willing to go with this? What risks am I willing to take? You know, are we willing to have our car taken? I mean, there have been situations in the past where that has happened, for instance. You know, how much inconvenience and headache and worry are you going to put up with? And so, you know, that was kind of a constant questions we would ask ourselves along the way. Now that we're retired and less of our income is taxable, that hasn't been so much of an issue for us more recently. But I wanted to say yet, I think one can't be too concerned about effectiveness. And I think we often found that for us, it was kind of a spiritual discipline, a sign of resistance, of refusing to fully acquiesce to the assumptions that our society makes about military solutions. That's the only way to find salvation and protection. So we found that it was important for us to struggle with this for the sake of our own souls and spirits. We also felt really compelled to do this work as a way of keeping faith with the people that we knew in Laos and in Vietnam and elsewhere, who have seen the other side of military action. And I guess we also believe it's good for the government to have people who challenge the status quo a bit, and force them to sort of justify these decisions and these policies. And so that's a bit of our journey. And I will say, I think in the chat box there are some references to NUTREC, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. That's a group that's been very helpful along the way, and you can find more information on the website about that. So I'll turn this back over to Rick now.
Thank you. I'll respond first by telling a quick story about a fork in the road experience I had, which was probably the experiential motivation for becoming a war tax resistor. After graduating in 1969 from what was then Eastern Mennonite College, I went to Jordan and then Afghanistan as a conscientious objector with the Mennonite Central Committee to fulfill my selective service obligations. While in Jordan, a civil war known as Black September broke out between the Jordanian army and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was the largest guerrilla group at that time. The war had reached such intensity that the American embassy, along with some other embassies, decided to evacuate its citizens. Now, during this time, the Jordanian army and several embassies were negotiating with the PLO in a hotel to provide foreigners a secure way to the airport to be evacuated on a chartered Swissair aircraft to Greece. Meanwhile, the US Sixth Fleet had moved into the Eastern Mediterranean, prepared to fly helicopters over Israel into Jordan to pick up Americans and take them to safety if the negotiating parties failed to reach an agreement. So, here is the first big ethical dilemma I faced in my life. What should I, a conscientious objector to war, do? Could I let a military force I could not join and whose methods I could not condone protect me in such a direct way? Maybe just take a second and think about what you would do if you were in that situation. Have you gotten on those helicopters or not? Here's what happened. I decided I could not get on those helicopters if they came. My conscience said no, I would remain in Jordan. The end of the story is that eventually the PLO agreed to give Americans and other foreigners security to the airport, and we were safely evacuated to Athens. And after several months, I went on to Afghanistan. So I never had to implement my decision. And of course, I may have gotten cold feet and gotten on those helicopters when the time came. Several weeks later, I returned my partially burned draft card to the selective service system and became a war tax resistor. Maybe just a word about Carolyn's and my experience in resisting war taxes, or maybe more appropriately called redirecting war taxes, since we don't keep the difference. We certainly aren't purist. We don't withhold 100% of our taxes that go to military spending. But it is, for us, a small way of going beyond talk to action and aligning our lives with our deepest values a little more. It's an act of saying there's a better way, a small statement of our witness for peace. And of course, it makes no difference to the IRS or in reducing military spending, but it does, as some of others had suggested, it does change us. And perhaps, as John Lewis said, it makes good trouble. What's been the response to the IRS? First, I'll say that we're really fortunate in having a faith community that supports these actions. Specifically in 1988, Community Mennonite Church, where we are members, took an official action to support, morally, financially, and otherwise, its members who, as an act of faith and conscience, choose to withhold all or some of their military taxes. And I think there's about, 8 or 10 households at Community Mennonite who do this. as well as a number of other households in the Harrisonburg area. So we're very grateful for that community. We're very above board in doing this with our tax returns. Each year we send a letter to the IRS explaining what we are doing and why, with copies to the White House, our Congress people, MCUSA, our local conference. And we also include Community Mennonites' letter of support, I think, which may have had some effect on never being audited or come after. Then each quarter, we get a computer-generated letter from the IRS. Actually, we just got one last week. Here it is, telling us that we're overdue and unpaid taxes, along with penalties and warnings. And I respond to each one, enclosing our original letter to the IRS, along with Community Mennonites' letter. And as with others were saying, Linda and Weldon, the IRS usually finds a way to get their money back. Typically, for us, it's been by putting a lien on our bank account, taking it from my Social Security, or from our Virginia state taxes due us. But that's okay. So that's our story on this.
Thank you. Thank you for, and if I open up the mic for many of our participants, they would also have rich stories to share as well. This question goes to you, Weldon. What are other ways that we can resist war in addition to becoming a war tax resistor?
Let me place this question, Sue, and everyone in larger historical context and connect it to today. I know all of you would have ways and places to be involved, but these are important to me. But the historical political context. Martin Luther King Jr. named the nation's spiritual dilemma and death in his defining Beyond Vietnam sermon at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967. Exactly 1 year later, he was killed for saying that and making that connection, naming the pervasive interwoven sin of militarism, racism, and materialism in the United States and us. It is imperative to keep that in heart and mind as we act locally, nationally, and globally. It calls for full and faithful contemplation and action, solidarity, and allyship. There are a myriad places and organizations and ways to actively resist militarism, always connected to racism and materialism. There are, of course, Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Central Committee, but let me name a few others that are important to me. Black Lives Matter, and I'm not even going to say much, I'm just going to name them, and you can find links very easily. But Black Lives Matter, Showing Up for Racial Justice, the Poor People's Campaign, Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, particularly the Mennonite portion of that as a movement of Anabaptist people of faith, and learning about that whole part of the settling of this land and colonization. Nonviolence International, Palestinian Christian co-founders Mubarak Awad and Jonathan Kutab, people I've met and have great respect for and have had connections to Mennonites with the Palestinian matter. Voices for Creative Nonviolence, whose founder and coordinator is Kathy Kelly, another dear friend. We were in Baghdad together in March of 2003 at the beginning of the war. And of course, Christian Peacemaker Team. So let me just say a word about that because that's where my life is committed to now. The CPT's mantra is building partnerships to transform violence and oppression. Building relationships with people targeted by violence and oppression of war by accompanying and advocating with and for people and amplifying their voices to the world. CPT, while the oppression that CPT works on is the oppression of war, it's connected to all other oppressions. And so CPT continually works at undoing all oppressions in ourselves. And CPT, oppressions of racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and all of those combined. And so just a final word and encouragement to explore those. They're local dimensions of these, national dimensions, global perspective. But we are called to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ by being spiritually grounded and building interfaith relationships and global perspective. Let me add that the polarization in our country is not between right and left, and certainly not even Democrat and Republican. It is between violence and nonviolence, domination or collaboration, empire or God, and we make that choice every day of our life. Martin Luther King concluded his Beyond Vietnam sermon with this prophetic truth. We have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violence co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. Friends, silence is violence. So I close with a personal story. Exactly a year ago, our then 9-year-old granddaughter was here staying overnight with us, and she came up to me and said, Grandpa, Einstein said, the world is not destroyed by evil. The world is destroyed by those who watch and do nothing. To that, I say, amen. And I encourage all of us to pray without ceasing and become what you pray. That is my encouragement. So Sue, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. That was a sermon for sure. Thank you for that. Thank you. And of course, our last question, I know our time has kind of whooped by, and I think we're still on time, which is incredible. And I'm going to give the last word to Linda. What words can you share to the younger generation who feel helpless and hopeless about resisting war and this culture of violence?
Yes, well, it can feel very overwhelming to know how to resist sort of the overwhelming nature of our culture's reliance on violence and belief in violence. Yet I would say that small steps are important. And if nothing else, I think they help keep us from becoming too conformed to the world and the way it tries to shape us and shape our faith and our lives. I would also say, and I don't know how many young people are listening, but decisions that you make when you're fairly young are really important. And I think for one decision for us that really was quite important was our decision to buy a house in a low-income neighborhood. Not having to pay a high mortgage bill allowed us to live much more simply and to minimize what we owed in taxes. And of course, I recognize now there are problems with gentrification and white people moving into poorer neighborhoods. So one has to be careful about that. But just to recognize that often young people make decisions, especially economic decisions, that really have an impact and affect the options that they have available to them later on. So it's important to think about those carefully. I would say it's also really important to find people who can support and encourage your beliefs and your desire, I think, to resist succumbing to the assumptions of mainstream American life. It was important for us to have people around us who understood our commitments and our desires in that regard. I think hopefully one can find this in your local church, but if not, you may need to find, to intentionally look for people who support your commitment to nonviolence and to conscientious objection. For many years in Lancaster, there was a group called Taxes for Life. This group was very important to us over many, many years. We met together for sharing, for picnics and volleyball. And then we would also organize worship services close to tax day. Especially years when tax day was close to Easter, we would organize Stations of the Cross walks throughout the city that really focused on the costs of militarism and violence. We also made joint decisions together about where to put our withheld monies. And so we'd make joint contributions. And of course now, I mean, there are other options for that, like the Mennonite Church USA Church Peace Tax Fund, for instance. So I would say, yeah, to really find people who can support you, that you can walk together and help hold you accountable, and also bring joy and lots of fun to your life as well. Those would be some important things that I hope young people can find as you find your way on these questions.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, because the church and our communities, we need to pass these wisdom, these life experiences and stories to the next generation. I think those are the questions that we have for the panelists in a formal way, but you also have an opportunity to ask them some questions as well. One that I saw, I think it was the first one, is help me to know how to support the child of God and not their military involvement. And perhaps, Anita, you're nodding your head. Maybe I'm going to kind of cue you to maybe, how do you do that?
Our church at Community Mennonite Church in Markham, where I pastored at first, we worked really hard at that. We're a very diverse community. And so we had those that had served in the military, some that were quite proud of their status as veterans, and Veterans Day came around and it needed to be honored. We had young ones that would choose to go into the military. And so what we did in all of those was make sure we spoke to the heart of the person. And so not when young men or women were going off to join the military, we would pray over their lives that they never had to take a life and that their lives would never be taken. That they would be able to do their time and comfortably come back out without any major scars over them. When it was Veterans Day, we would allow them to tell us some of their experiences of what it was like, how they survived, how they, whatever that meant for their lives. And we tried to honor that person and not the actual way in which the larger understanding of war and militarism. And we spoke very clearly as a church that was not what we were, we did not believe that was part of what it meant as Christians and our witness as Christ followers, that war was not the answer and there were other alternatives. So we held them both there, even in the tension, and there was a lot of tension, but they knew that we loved them, and we knew that they loved us. And so it was holding those tense spaces together.
Wow, that's really hard and complicated and messy, isn't it? Other panelists want to chime into that question? If not, I'll go. I
was struck with Sunitha's article in the Mennonite Women, Mennonite USA Women. I'm not sure if I got the title right, about Mennonites saying don't join the military, but for a lot of Black and brown people, that's the best option available. Mm. And so the question that you were raising is, what are we doing about that? And I think that's spot on. Mm. And leaves responsibility on us as a peace church to take steps to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the messiness of it, right? It's we really have to know the context of who we're speaking to and how to love them in a contextualized way, understanding their circumstances. One of the comments, I don't know if anybody wants to respond to this, could we make war tax refusal a symbolic gesture comparable to the symbol of the flag for most Americans? Any thoughts, comments? Yes.
Yeah, I might respond to that a little bit. I don't know if we can, but maybe more importantly, simply to say that we really have a strong need this time in this country, in the church and in culture, to talk about how symbols work and how we misuse and abuse them in ways that harm other people. That's the key issue. So that's because symbols are powerful, rituals are powerful, and we have ways of doing that. So that really does need our attention, including in particular voting, which is very, very important, but it's not the only thing, and has its upside and downside. So anyway, I say yes, it needs attention. And I don't have much more than that to say. Thank you.
Right, and that was another question. Why do we think that voting is a more significant symbol or patriotic duty than symbolic war resistance? So I think you kind of answered that. I'm trying to scroll down because we have a lot of things down here.
I would also say, I think it's important for us to know that there are a lot of young people, there are a lot of people of color that don't even know that they could resist this understanding of resisting war taxes. That part of the problem is the message is lost. And so, and it's one thing to tell somebody to do it and then also tell them that the IRS is still going to be breathing back, right? So helping people I love how Linda said it becomes a spiritual practice to do that. But I think part of the biggest problem is, again, our churches haven't been talking about possibilities, right? And so we have to do a better job, especially the Anabaptist church. We have to do a better job of talking through this and making sure people are aware of this.
Thank you. And to see that there's a tradition, right? That's the gift that we have. And someone had mentioned Stan Bond and just wanted to lift up his name as he has entered hospice care, a faithful war and peacemaker. Is the MCUSA Justice Fund a way to redirect war taxes and perhaps support youth who are faced with the dilemma of joining the military? I guess I can answer that maybe, is that if your church is involved in that kind of work, then you can definitely apply, especially if you are addressing poverty, racism. That is something that we help you to decide where is your mission, where's your direction for your context, and how are you working with organizations led by people of color, especially, to do this work. And if that is the work that you're doing, that is one way that you can do it. Another way is, and that just kind of flows nicely too, I think we have a slide, and I know a lot of us in this are also aware of the Church Tax Peace Fund, Peace Tax Fund, sorry, that we have as a church to help people to redirect their war tax resisting dollars. And so, and I know many of us here, I know John Stoner and HA has been very faithful in that long journey. And I just wanted to give a shout out to them as well for their faithful witness to keep us always having that priority as a church. My goodness, our time is almost done here. I am just so grateful for all of you who have, especially the panelists. We have packed a punch in an hour. I have learned so much. And not only were your words inspiring, but your life gives us new breath as we re-engage in the conversation of militarism as in the larger church. As all of you know, this work needs to continue, and it's not just MCUSA office that is doing this work. It is really all of us doing this work together and pushing it and demanding it, resisting it in your communities as well as in your congregations. And then to tell us about it, share it with us. You send me an email so we can put that in our peace mail. That's another way that we can continue to stay connected with you all of this work of resisting war. Tell us your stories, continue to inspire others, and just want to thank you. Yes, somebody said cost of war on environment. Actually, Mennonite Creation Care Network just had a webinar on the impact of war and environmentalism. The cost of war, I know we had focused here just on the cost of war, looking at the economics, but the larger Mennonites against militarism that Sunitha and I are also part of. We're also looking at the impact of environmentalism, environment and war. We're also looking at and revisiting our theology as pacifists. And so this is just one of the many things that we're doing. And I'm so glad that you have joined us. Be well, good night. This will be recorded and it will be on our Cost of War webinar page. So we will continue to send you more information regarding that. Blessings and peace be with you.